So it was quite the spectacle. It was one of the first executive orders that Trump signed, and he was banning trans athletes from women's sports. And he was surrounded by little girls and young women as if he was trying to care and protect. Clearly, if he was trying to care and protect for our young, he would be signing executive orders about climate and gun control and health care and hunger. I mean, if you want to ban something, right, that's a danger for our young people, how about plastic bags, right? How about AR-15s? How about seeing that all kids, especially our young, are getting vaccinated for that cervical cancer situation, right? Or just trying to see that they have everything that they need, to see that they can have the reproductive care they need. But clearly, this is not about protection and care. This is about power and control. And it's using gender as a way to further the empire. And sometimes it's just helpful to call that out. Gender is a complicated, construction that has biological, environmental, social factors, and it's hard to understand the whole thing. But sometimes gender is used as a weapon, and that's what's going on here. And it's interesting because it's not a new thing. And it shows up even somewhere where I would not expect it, in the Gospel of Luke. When I was in seminary in the 80s, it was very commonly understood that Luke was the feminist gospel. Luke has a lot more stories about women, and Luke is the social justice gospel. Remember how Jesus launches his ministry, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, I've been called to preach good news to the poor. Luke is down and dirty with the people. But then, in the last 20, 30 years, 40 years, more scholars, more women scholars writing, and they're like, well, to be totally honest, Luke has a lot of women, but they don't get to say much. They have small roles, and often Luke, and in his second volume, Acts, when he tells a story about women, he pairs it with stories about men, so that it gets kind of diluted. And so they kind of step back and I don't know, maybe John's really got a little bit more development going on with female characters. Mary D'Angelo taught theology at University of Notre Dame, and she studied and focused on gender and early Christian origins. And she wrote a really interesting essay, not just about kind of the role of women in Luke's gospel and kind of how he really puts women in their place, kind of their benefactors, and they're hospitable and they're, traditional women, but also it was about masculinity. And she highlighted how Luke's gospel is a lot more fixated on masculinity than the others. Like the narrator in Luke speaks with a male voice, and the Gospel of Mark has the Greek word for man 4 times, and in Luke's gospel it's in there 27 times, and in the book of Acts it's in there 50-something times, and Luke, different than the others, kind of really stresses the maleness of the disciples, and Jesus is this masculine figure. And you kind of look at that and you go well, what's going on here? Because Luke also still has this Jesus who's, kind of with the poor and trying to call for social change. And what she and other scholars point out is that, Luke was probably conflicted, right? I think about me. I want a very different world. And yesterday I'm walking my dog thinking, oh my God, should I move money out of the market and buy a different house or get gold or what? We're conflicted, right? We want a different world. We're also terrified of what's going on. And so she points out, along with other scholars, that part of what's going on is Luke is writing in the early 2nd century almost, and he is writing to kind of an elite Greek-Roman audience. You know how he starts the gospel, I'm writing to Theophilus, this is an orderly account. He's kind of basically saying, you powerful people, don't have to be afraid of these Christians. They're not snake handlers, they're Episcopalians. It's kind of like that, It's kind of like, these people are respectable, and they're not going to get in your way, and they're not going to disrupt. In fact, the women in this tradition, they know their place. This is a place where men are men and women are women, right? It's kind of like there's this way of saying, you really don't need to be afraid because these people will not be disruptors. And maybe he's trying to avoid Roman domination and, he's trying to fly under the radar, right? And it's not a new thing. You see it right now in what's going on with Elon Musk. Kara Swisher is a journalist. She has written about Musk for 30-something years. We need to find out what medicine she's on, right? And she's written about tech. That's her big thing. That's what she covers. And she's written about, just like Musk, she's like knows everything about him, like the big hole, she says, in the center of his character, about the love and care he didn't get as a kid. And of course, like a lot of these guys, disproportionate number, grew up in South Africa during the good old days of apartheid, right, when 8% of the white people controlled 92% of the other people, dominated. That was what he grew up on. And then she's written a lot about masculinity, about how these tech bros, proud boys, promise keepers, they've moved increasingly to the right, increasingly to this idea that what's really wrong with this country is too womanly, it's too soft, it's too feminized, and what we've really lost is the male virtues of aggression and combat and conflict and risk-taking and making decisions to hell with whatever comes, right? So she talks about how this kind of gets played out in their costuming, their cowboy hats and their tight shirts and their chains and their girlfriend on their arm and doing the martial arts. And do you remember, like, sometimes it's like almost ridiculous? Do you remember in July of 2023 when Mark Zuckerberg challenged Elon Musk to fight him in a cage? Do you remember that? Like, you can look at that up in the New York Times. They spent 10 days, folks, talking about this back and forth with the UFC. I mean, they were actually really, Zuckerberg was actually serious. Elon Musk, evidently, is older, didn't really want to do it. But they spent 10 days talking about how they were going to fight like this, along with their other tech bros who were like, this is a good idea because what we have lost in this country is the Greek virtues of masculinity and manhood, and this is a way to assert it. Now, you could just dismiss all of this as these guys are just crazy, right? Except look at the damage that they have done in the last 3 weeks to this country. If it was just that this week, an Afghan interpreter who stood with our troops, whose family is already here, had his travel documents and was coming, and he's not. If it was just that there was a refugee coming here 2 days after Trump was inaugurated, who's been in a refugee camp in Ethiopia, whose wife and 2 children came 9 years ago, and he has been in a refugee camp since 1995, it is thousands, right? Hundreds and thousands. And it was just civil servants who have given their life. If it was just USAID and family planning, and the trauma is not really that new, because it really has been going on for decades, some decades, as the economy in this country has become much more empire-like. I don't know if anybody saw it, but it's worth checking out. February 3rd, the New York Times had a story in there about a study looking at the health of our country. It was a very thorough study, lots of graphs and all this, and they had taken a group of economists from the right to the left who didn't agree with one another, who've all worked with presidents since 1990, and it took them a while. They agreed on 37 different barometers to judge the health of our country, like socially, financially, culturally, physically, all of it. It was kind of staggering. It's stuff we know, but I didn't really realize that our economy has just skyrocketed. Like, we're the fastest growing economy of any of the rich countries. We're the second economy only to China. But the difference, of course, is that it's so skewed, right? The social inequity is so great that the average doesn't really mean anything. So then it goes on to look at our country, that of all the rich nations, we have the lowest life expectancy, highest death by gun rate, highest death by opioid, highest youth depression, lowest trust in the government. And their whole thing is, it's because we've just been consumed with growth, to hell with the social net, and people have just completely pulled apart from one another, which is what we've known and what we've seen. And that's about, like, people who are managed to get in there and totally control the economy. And there is another way. There is another way. I meant to show the Gangsta Grass Gospel video, right? Oh, shoot, I'm going to show it after this. But some of you know that a few of us, the Friday after the election, went to see this group called Gangsta Grass. It's a bluegrass and a hip-hop group. It's 5 guys, black and white, and they've been together for 20-something years. And one of the songs they sing is, "We all do better when we all do better. Can't get better than that." It sounds silly, but there's like this, everybody, it was like the holiest moment. We're going to have to show it because you got to see it. But that's the other way of living in the world. And it's what we hear in the Sermon on the Plain, which, again, a little bit different than the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount, which we're more familiar with, 4 times longer. Jesus shows up kind of on a mountain, kind of like Moses. He's going to hand down the 10 Commandments. But on Luke's Gospel, Jesus shows up on a level place. And it's not just geography, it's leveling up. Remember how Mary begins in the Gospel of Luke saying what? You know, my God, my God, you know, God has brought the rich down and lifted up the lonely. It's lifted up the lowly. It's this leveling where we're all in here together. And whereas Matthew has, blessed are the poor in spirit, Luke has, blessed are the poor. Matthew has, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, and Luke just has, blessed are the hungry. Blessed are those who weep. Blessed are those who are excluded. And the point here is not a command. Jesus isn't saying, go out and be hungry and poor, go out and be sad. It's more like an announcement of something that we know is true. Like, who here does not know, without kind of giving into kind of poverty porn where we have pictures and idealize the poor and show little kids with their stomachs all bloated and raise money, who here does not know that people who are struggling and suffering have a gift, a blessedness, a happiness, because what? They know they're dependent on one another. They don't have the illusion of empire. They don't go around and say stupid crap like, I'm the only one who can fix this, right? Because they know what? We all do better when we all do better. You can't get better than that. I mean, there's this understanding that we have to be connected to one another. I mean, it's a different way of seeing it, right? And it's the way that you see over and over and over through Luke's gospel coming through, even though he's trying to dance around the empire and say, don't be afraid of our people. We're not going to stir the pot. You're like, but here you got this radical Jesus who's like coming out here saying, you know, yeah, we're letting the oppressed go free. That is the kind of masculinity that we got in spades at Peace Church. That is the kind of masculinity of people, of men, boys, whatever you want to say, who are comfortable in their own skin. Comfortable enough that they don't have to go around competing. They're looking for community, right? They're not trying to overpower, they're trying to empower. And a lot of you have heard me tell this story, but it has stayed with me. It's going to be, you know, like you think when you come to die and you have those, you know, these things are going to run through your head. This is going to be one of those moments. It was in November. Michelle and Jonathan had been married 30 years. Jonathan, you know, your average church accountant guy, their kids, said, hey, you know what? At age 50, Jonathan's realized he's on you. He's a woman, and that's who he is. And we're not expecting to get a lot of support from our family, but we expect to get, we hope, we pray, maybe from Peace Church. Maybe you could talk to a few people before Anya shows up. He kind of gave me a few folks. So I was in November, right up there at the Brick, when some of the 70-year-old guys had just done their action of collecting food to take to Cherith Brook. And we sat down, and I said, hey, Jonathan is now going to be Anya. And without missing a beat, how do you spell Anya? Because we want to be sure we get that right. That was the first thing someone said. And the next thing was, how can we be supportive of the family? I mean, I got to be honest, folks. I was kind of like, I expected support, but people are just like, because guess what? These guys are secure in who they are. They don't have to need, who really gives a, how much time do you have to think about other people's sexuality, really? I don't know. I need to get our basement cleared out, right? If you've got a lot of time like that, you just go ahead and come on over if this is your big exception, because we got stuff we could do at our house. And it's also not lost on me that these guys were coming from a collective action of sorts, because that is what scholars are telling us over and over and over again, that true joy, true efficacy, true sense of community comes not just from acting, but from collective acting. All these scholars who write about climate anxiety and how ripped up we are for good reason. If you get out and you plant trees or you protest the pipeline, for a long time people have thought it's acting. Now they're really clear that it's collective acting. It's acting together. It's finding a group of people. It's saying, you know what, we all got to go forward together. Bob Wechter was a person who lived that every day. Bob went off, sent by this country in Vietnam. He served 2 tours of duty, back to back. You know why? Because he didn't want anybody else to see what he saw as a Marine. He went with demons. He came back with more demons. And he's been his entire life, got a mental health counseling degree, then worked for the VA, served this country his whole life. I met Bob the very first time when we were at the Vietnam Memorial on that Veterans Day in 1987, and he wanted me to say a prayer. And I stood at that memorial with Bob many times the next 30-something years, holding a sign, stop the war before Iraq, holding other signs, stop the war before whatever the next war was. The last time we were there together, before his health just made it hard for him to stand for long, was during Trump's first administration when he was going after LGBTQ service people in the military. We stood there together at this vigil. I remember Bob standing there. The people around Bob, now an old man, really looked old from all that he'd been through. And all these young people, Bob's age, when he went off to Vietnam. It was a rough time, folks, right? And we have, thankfully, one another. We have witnesses around us, people who have loved and cared and served and opened their arms and said, thank you for being you, right? Thank you for allowing me to be who I am. Thank you for calling out the best of who I am. May we all find a way to collectively love, to collectively serve. Amen.
We all do better when we all do better. You can't get better than that. The elders used to say that if you knew better, you do better. That's what we're doing together. The power that be wish that me and you sever. All the times that bind us up to help us make it through weather. And now you got a paper stack of really huge cheddar over a bunch of certified alphabet soup letters. We can't collaborate, cooperate, or getting by. Bills and cents substantial enough to lift us up high as one. The value of a nation is increased by the virtue of the treatment it extends to the least of us. Is the value of a life governed by the greedy, or determined to heal the sick and feed the needy? If we reach to our neighbors when the storm is wreaking havoc, then we each have a better chance of staving off the damage. That's a demonstrated fact. Come together as a pack, and there ain't nothing wrong with that. And that's that. Come on. We all do better when we all do better. You can't get better.